I think I just read the same sentence 10 times in a row, and I still couldn't tell you what it was about. Maybe it is time for a break. I think I just read the same sentence 10 times in a row, and I still couldn't tell you what it was about. Maybe it is time for a break. Sorry. What I was going to say is, there's no point in reading if you're not taking in what you read. Before you even sit down to read a book or article or textbook chapter, there's some prep work you can do to improve your reading and comprehension. Preview the text so you know what you're reading. Okay, this chapter of my social studies book is about the Harlem Renaissance. I don't really know anything about that. I mean, I've heard of it. I know that Harlem's a part of New York City. Well, I'm going to learn about it right now. You can skim or quickly look over what you're reading to get an overall impression. Pay attention to section headings and words in bold. Let's see, writers of the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes. Hey, I've read some of his writing. Take notes while you read. Use note cards or a notebook to write down important ideas. Hang on a sec. Take your time. Stop and reread anything that you don't understand. And jot down any words that you don't know. There's one, ragtime. That way you can look it up later. If you can put what you're reading into your own words, you'll know you can understand it. So, the Harlem Renaissance was a time that celebrated African American heritage and culture. And obviously, it took place in New York City, in Harlem. If you have time, it's a great idea to reread your assignment. You may have missed something the first time through. You can also go back over your notes to refresh your memory. I'm reading a textbook, but you can apply these reading skills to anything you read. Oh yeah, Moby and I like to make a movie in our heads. If you can visualize what you're reading, you know you're getting it. This helps a lot when you're reading a novel, like a book report book, where you have to keep track of a story and characters. When you're done with a reading assignment, there's nothing wrong with talking to friends, parents, or teachers about what you've read. Talking about a text helps you better understand it and form ideas of your own. You might carry these ideas over into a paper or presentation. Oh, and you can look up those new vocabulary words. Okay, Moby, ragtime is a type of jazz music that has a syncopated rhythm. Moby? Well, I'm gonna get back to reading this. I don't think I mentioned this, but it's a good idea to find a quiet place to read your book. I'm going to the library!
The next day at Edenville is Mr. Jackson. Let's get started.
Whoa, $20? What do I have to do? Dear Tim and Moby, who was Andrew Jackson? From Brittany. Andrew Jackson was the 7th President of the United States. He served from 1829 to 1837 and was one of the most influential U.S. presidents of the 19th century. Well, unlike the first 6 presidents, Jackson came from humble beginnings. He was born in 1767 in an unsettled area of the Carolinas. His parents were poor farmers, and he had a typical frontier childhood filled with hunting, fishing, and the occasional class at a one-room schoolhouse. But tragically, his entire family, his father, his mother, and 2 brothers, died by the time Andrew was 14. Yeah, it's amazing he overcame a background like that. As a young man, Jackson began a successful law practice in Nashville, Tennessee, and married the daughter of a prominent local family. He eventually became a judge and bought a cotton plantation called the Hermitage. Yeah. Yeah, he did own slaves, about 150 of them by the time he died. He also developed a reputation for a bad temper, and he fought in duels of honor throughout his adulthood. His reputation hurt his early political ambitions, but it came in handy when the War of 1812 broke out with England. Jackson was commissioned as a major general in the U.S. Army. In the Battle of New Orleans, he led outnumbered American forces to a surprise victory over the British. For his toughness, Jackson earned the nickname Old Hickory. Well, as wood goes, Hickory's pretty strong. Anyway, he became a national hero, and in 1824, he ran for president. He won 41% of the vote, more than any of the other candidates. But without a majority of at least 51%, Congress had to pick a winner. In a backroom deal, they chose John Quincy Adams. Yeah, it wasn't really fair. Washington insiders didn't want someone as uneducated, violent, and, well, low class as Jackson to be president. But in the next election, Jackson used that image to his own advantage. He campaigned as a populist, representing the common man against the rich and powerful. Joining with old political rivals, he formed the modern Democratic Party. When he won the election, Jackson invited the public to come celebrate. Thousands flooded the White House for his inauguration party, which, got a little out of hand. Well, he thought government should be more responsive to the people. Before his administration, many federal jobs were held for life by the well-connected. Jackson replaced as many of these people as he could with new blood. Critics claimed he'd created a spoils system, rewarding political allies with jobs they didn't deserve. But Jackson continued his populist reforms, focusing next on the Second Bank of the United States. Created in 1816, it was the federal government's official bank. He spoke out for its destruction, arguing that it had become corrupt and far too powerful. Americans approved of these policies and re-elected Jackson in 1832. In his second term, he destroyed the Second Bank by withdrawing all government money from it. Yeah, Jackson's grab for power made him a lot of enemies. He was even known as King Andrew among his critics, and his actions during the nullification crisis strengthened this view. In 1832, the state of South Carolina refused to collect a federal tariff or tax on goods imported from Europe. In Jackson's view, states couldn't pick and choose which federal laws they wanted to enforce. Well, after he threatened to send in the army, South Carolina compromised by agreeing to a lower tariff. Most people today would agree with Jackson, but back then, many thought he was overstepping his power. The crisis turned out to be a major defeat for Southern slaveholders. But it's not like Jackson was turning into a big supporter of civil rights. He actually tried, unsuccessfully, to outlaw all anti-slavery literature. He also signed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the government to negotiate land treaties with American Indian tribes. In practice, negotiating had nothing to do with it. Tribal leaders were pretty much forced into signing unfair treaties. You're right, Jackson was complicated, with both good and bad qualities. In the end, he increased the power of the presidency, while at the same time making it more responsive to the public. After his second term ended in 1837, Jackson retired to the Hermitage. He remained immensely popular, serving as an informal advisor to future presidents until he died in 1845. Now, can I have my $20? Moby?
Moby, this prize ready yet? Wow, you're really earning that $7.25 an hour. Dear Moby, why do we have tax taxes. Sincerely, Bentham 18. Well, every service that the government provides is paid for by taxes. In fact, taxes pay for a lot of things that you might take for granted. Just take a look outside. Without taxes, roads wouldn't be paved, bridges and tunnels wouldn't be built, and there wouldn't be any public buses or trains. There'd be no public schools, no police departments, no fire departments, and no military either. Every government employee, from the President of the United States to public school teachers, and from police officers to garbage collectors, depends on tax money for their salary. Well, there'd probably still be French fries. Taxes are as old as society itself. Back in ancient Egypt, farmers had to give a percentage of their crops to the pharaoh. In fact, all the way up to the 19th century, you could either pay taxes in cash or as a percentage of your sheep, or your grain, or your fabric, basically with whatever you had. Nope, sorry, you can't do that today. Anyway, since taxes pay for so much stuff, there are lots of different tax types. Federal taxes are used by the national government to pay for things like interstate highways, national parks and monuments, and the military. The federal tax system is overseen by an organization based in Washington, D.C. called the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS. And state and local taxes pay for, well, stuff that you'd find in your state or your town, like schools, hospitals, and parks, and sometimes even sports stadiums. Well, they're collected in a lot of different ways. For example, there's sales tax. That's calculated as a percentage of the price of the things you buy. Sales tax in this state is about 6%, so when you buy a $1 hamburger, you actually have to pay $1.06 because of sales tax. Yeah, you're probably thinking of income tax. If you have a job, the government takes those taxes right out of your paycheck. Here, take a look at mine. It says that I made $200 this week, but I don't get to take home $200. This tax is specifically for Social Security, a federal program that helps retired citizens support themselves. This tax is from the state government. And this tax is for robot. Wait a minute. Nice try, sort of. Anyway, in most Western countries, income tax is progressive. That means that as you make more money, you have to pay a higher percentage of it to the government. For example, let's say you make $25,000 a year. The government might only take 10% of your earnings. But if you make $100,000, the government might take 25%. And if you make $1 million, the government might take 35%. And it's not just for individual people. Businesses and corporations have to pay taxes too. Right, and the government checks to make sure everyone is paying the right amount of taxes. Each year, every individual and corporation has to file a report to the IRS called a tax return. It's basically just a bunch of forms that indicate how much money you made that year and how much money you paid in income taxes. There are complex formulas for calculating exactly what your tax amount should have been, and sometimes people pay too much or too little. So, if you happen to have paid more than your fair share, the government pays you back after you file your tax return. But if you owe taxes, you have to pay up, or else risk getting fined or even jailed. U.S. tax returns for the previous year are due in the mail by tax day, which is usually April 15th. Alright, Moby, let's go deposit these paychecks. How dumb do you think I am? No, I guess I don't want you to answer that. Tim and Moby. Who was Charles Darwin? Yours very sincerely, Helen. Charles Darwin was a British naturalist who developed the modern theory of evolution in the 19th century. After early training in medicine and theology, Darwin studied nature, learning about anatomy, geology, and classification. All that study paid off when he signed on for a job on the HMS Beagle. The Beagle sailed to South America in 1831 to map the continent's coastline. The voyage lasted 5 years, during which Darwin collected and studied hundreds of species of plants and animals. His most famous work was done in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. Darwin was interested in why mockingbirds were different from island to island. Each bird had a beak that was well suited for the type of food available on its home island. Later, he found that tortoises and finches differed among the islands too. Darwin came to believe that all the finch species must have evolved or changed over time from a common ancestor. He thought that these changes would require a very long time to happen. No, he wasn't the first scientist to think that life forms change from generation to generation. Before he formed his own ideas, Darwin agreed with Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory of evolution. Now, according to Lamarck, animals that use a certain body part a lot will develop great strength or size in that part. He believed that these changes would then be passed on to the next generation. Darwin didn't quite see it like that. He believed animals couldn't pass on traits they developed during their own lifetimes. We'll think of it this way. If two, say, bodybuilders have a baby, it won't be born any more muscular than average. According to Darwin, animals have to struggle for resources like food and land. Their ultimate goal is to live long enough to reproduce. Animals born with advantageous traits are just likelier to live long enough to reach that goal. Those traits will then be passed on to their offspring. Animals with disadvantageous traits are less likely to survive and have kids. So those traits are less likely to get passed on. Well, it's not a very nice system. Darwin called the process natural selection. He said that tiny changes accumulating over hundreds of thousands of years would lead to the kind of variations he observed in the Galapagos mockingbirds. In 1859, Darwin published his findings in a book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Many people opposed the theory of evolution because it seemed to conflict with their religious beliefs. Oh, no, Darwin never said that humans came from monkeys. He said that people and primates both evolved from a common ancestor. Darwin continued to write and speak about evolution until his death in 1882. He published several more editions of The Origin of Species that expanded on his original theory. Well, it's called the theory of evolution, but a scientific theory isn't just a guess. In science, a theory is an idea that's supported by repeated experimentation and hard evidence. Most scientists today accept an updated version of Darwin's evolutionary theory that includes what we now know about genetics and heredity. Wow, that thing's pretty successful. I fear you have created a monster. causes pollution? From Dahlia. Air pollution comes from a lot of different sources, like car engines. They burn gasoline, and that adds a lot of dangerous chemicals to the air. Power plants, factories, and even the furnaces and stoves we use to heat homes and offices, all of these pollute the air. 12 fossil fuels like coal, gas, and oil release particles of soot and dust when they're burned. They also release deadly gases like carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. These gases can make healthy people sick and sick people even worse. They can make your eyes water and your throat feel dry. In some cases, they can permanently damage your lungs and even cause cancer. Plus, they're greenhouse gases, so they contribute to global warming. See that? That's smog. It's a mixture of smoke and fog that forms over cities, and it's not good for us to breathe. Smog contains ozone, a molecule made of 3 oxygen atoms. High up in the atmosphere, the ozone layer protects Earth from solar radiation. But when ozone is down here in the lower atmosphere, it reacts with other molecules to produce deadly poisons. And the ozone layer isn't safe from air pollution either. Chemicals released by humans have thinned it out, allowing harmful ultraviolet rays to reach the Earth's surface. Righto, Moby, acid rain is another result of air pollution. All those pollutants in the air can combine with water droplets and then fall down to Earth as rain. Acid rain has a lower pH than normal rain. When it soaks into the ground or falls into bodies of water, those habitats become too acidic, and the organisms that live in them are destroyed. Oh, pollution can come from natural sources too, like wildfires, volcanic eruptions, even cow burps. Laugh all you want, but cow burps contain a harmful gas called methane. And cows produce about 80 million metric tons of it every year. Well, we can ride bikes and walk for transportation. And if we have to drive, we can drive hybrid cars. No, this one isn't. But maybe we can convince Mom and Dad to buy a hybrid when they need a new car. We can also insulate our homes so they don't need so much energy to heat and cool. Every little bit of electricity we save means less that has to be produced by burning fossil fuels, all of which can lead to less air pollution and a cleaner planet in general. So, are we going home now? Well, that's nice that you don't want to make any more pollution today, but we need to get home. Hey, I think it's your turn to push. Those are gantry cranes. They unload shipping containers from every corner of the Earth. Some say they were George Lucas's inspiration for... Whoa, better keep your eyes peeled. Dear Tim and Moby, who was Adam Smith? From Spike. Adam Smith was an 18th century Scottish philosopher. He wrote The Wealth of Nations, which pretty much invented the field of modern economics. I bet you're going to ask. Well, Moby, economics is the study of how people produce, buy, and sell goods and services. Goods are things you can buy, like hot dogs and MP3 players, while services are tasks that you pay people to do, like auto repair and dentistry. Anyhow, Adam Smith was born in 1723. He was an exceptional student. At the tender age of 14, he enrolled in college at the University of Glasgow. After a lengthy education, Smith made a living giving public lectures, and he later became a professor at Glasgow. Like many men of his era, Adam Smith believed that scientific inquiry could provide answers to just about anything, even social problems. In fact, in his first major work, he proposed that the more freedom individuals had, the more harmonious society would be. Smith carried this theme into his next book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, or the Wealth of Nations for short. At the time, European nations believed that amassing lots of gold and silver was the best way to strengthen their economies. Since these two metals are limited in supply, it followed that one country's gain was another's loss. So each nation tried to make more money on exports than it spent on imports. Exports are goods sold to other countries, and imports are goods bought from other countries. To accomplish this, governments actively interfered with the economy. They supported their own nation's industries and discouraged the purchase of goods from other countries. This system was known as mercantilism. Well, Smith wrote that wealth isn't a zero-sum game where one country's gain is necessarily another's loss. Instead, he suggested that wealth comes from labor, not gold or silver. If a shoemaker works harder this year than he did last year and produces more shoes, his extra labor has generated wealth. So, a country's economy can grow through increased labor or productivity without decreasing the wealth of its neighbors. Okay, so Smith identified three general strategies for helping economies grow. First, letting people pursue their own self-interest or individual goals. It may sound selfish, but according to Smith, when individuals work to enrich themselves, they benefit society as a whole. Smith called this the invisible hand of the marketplace, leading individuals to work for the greater good, even though their main concern is themselves. The second strategy is division of labor. You can produce more goods when work is broken up into simple tasks. And the third is free trade. When governments stay out of the way of international trade, everyone benefits. Overall, the Wealth of Nations said that a free market is preferable to an economy directed by the government. This idea became known as laissez-faire, French for let it be. Well, he wasn't arguing for 100% free markets. Smith believed that governments have a valuable role to play in making sure that everything stays fair. Funny you should ask. The Wealth of Nations came out in 1776, the same year that the American colonies broke away from England. Like the American Revolution, Smith's ideas flowed from the principle of individual freedom. They were quite controversial at the time. But by the late 1800s, both democracy and Smith's vision of free market capitalism had become widely accepted. And more than 200 years later, The Wealth of Nations is essential reading for any student of economics. For writing the first systematic scientific study in the field, Smith is now known as the father of modern economics. He died in 1790. So this is your big shipment, huh? A million pairs? Yeah, you'll make a killing on those. Dear Tim and Moby, what in the world are atoms? From Chris. What in the world isn't an atom? Air, water, pants, leaves, robots, and humans are all made up of atoms. This is the periodic table of elements, and when you take chemistry, it becomes your best friend. This chart shows and predicts every known element in the universe: oxygen, iron, lead, and so on. These elements are all made of atoms. Around 2,400 years ago, a Greek guy named Democritus argued that everything in the world was made up of particles so small they could not be cut in half. He called these tiny things atoms from the Greek word atomos, which means indivisible. In the 1800s, another guy named John Dalton refined the idea with his theory that atoms are the smallest particle of an element that retains its chemical properties. That means if you break apart an atom of an element like carbon, it's not carbon anymore. What is it? Well, atoms are made up of even tinier subatomic particles called protons, neutrons, and electrons. The atom's center, or nucleus, is a cluster of protons and neutrons. Protons have a positive electrical charge, and neutrons have no electrical charge. The atom's nucleus is held together by the strong force, which keeps the positively charged protons from repelling each other. The nucleus is surrounded by a cloud of electrons moving near the speed of light. The electrons have a negative charge that attracts them to the protons, and they live in shells representing different energy levels. On the periodic table, atoms are organized by their atomic number, which is really their number of protons, or electrons. You can also find the atomic mass here, as well as the element's symbol. I kind of think it's amazing that the difference of a few little protons, electrons, and neutrons can produce such a variety of elements with completely different properties. Different types of atoms can bond together to make molecules. Water is a molecule. It's two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen, or H2O for short. You would not believe how small atoms are. It would take nearly 10 billion atoms just to cross this dot. And the scale of the atom itself is even more ridiculous. If the nucleus was the size of an apple, the electrons would be 5 whole football fields away. Ow! That means all matter in the universe is mostly made up of empty space, which frankly blows my mind.
Jump up, please. Come. Come, please. Come look.
Hey, what's your grandma doing here? Little joke. Grandma. Dear Tim and Moby, I would like to know about the history of computers. Thank you, Serena. Hey there. You might be surprised at how far back the history of computers goes. It starts thousands of years ago with the invention of the first devices for storing numbers. We don't need to go that far back. That's better. People have used mechanical calculators like the abacus since ancient times. astronomers took it a step further with precision instruments that... Hey, what's your grandma doing here? Little joke, Grandma. Dear Tim and Moby, I would like to know about the history of computers. Thank you, Serena. Hey there. You might be surprised at how far back the history of computers goes. It starts thousands of years ago with the invention of the first devices for storing numbers. We don't need to go that far back. That's better. People have used mechanical calculators like the abacus since ancient times. Greek astronomers took it a step further with precision instruments that track the stars. These devices are the distant ancestors of the central processing unit, the heart, brain of the modern computer. A CPU can perform millions of calculations per second. So how did we get from there to here? Well, sure, electricity was important. But the modern computing age began with mechanical devices built by a 19th century British mathematician named Charles Babbage. Babbage's machines used gears to store numbers and do complex math. He designed one that could read punch cards to do different calculations. In other words, he made it programmable. His colleague, Ada Lovelace, demonstrated that with the world's first computer programs. Decades later, American inventor Herman Hollerith built a computer to help count the 1890 census. Like Babbage's machines, it used punch cards and gears, but it was driven by electricity. Businesses used Hollerith's machine to track all sorts of stuff, and his company grew into the biggest computer maker in the world, IBM. The problem was, these early computers all had to be custom built. Well, like you couldn't program a census machine to keep track of train schedules. That began to change 50 years later as European nations and America prepared for World War II. High-powered machines were needed for all kinds of jobs, from weapons targeting to decoding secret messages. So governments raced to build a whole new generation of computers. Instead of gears, these machines used electricity to represent numbers and operations. Well, the simplest way is with an electric switch. On means 1 and off means 0. Strings of ones and zeros, or binary code, can represent words, numbers, and even sounds and images. For example, here's one way to represent Tim in binary. Electricity could also be amplified or boosted to represent different math operations. Now imagine thousands of switches and amplifiers all hooked up together. Yep, then you could perform super complex calculations and way faster than any mechanical device. During World War II, Britain's Colossus relied on 2,000 switches and amplifiers to decode enemy messages. America's ENIAC had almost 10 times that, allowing it to run 5,000 calculations per second. Yep, by today's standards, these room-sized machines are pretty clunky, but their use of electric switches was revolutionary. The biggest advances since then have really just been refinements of that basic design. First, the transistor was invented shortly after the war. A transistor is a switch that's smaller, faster, and more reliable than the glass tubes from before. Next, microprocessors put many transistors onto a single chip. The number of transistors that could fit grew every year. By the late 1960s, one tiny processor could do the work of Colossus and ENIAC combined. Still, computers weren't something the average person ever used. They were for the same people who'd been using them since the 19th century: government agencies, know the best way to study for tests? I want to get better grades. From Angela. Don't we all? Let's take a break. It's important to take breaks while you study. There's no best way to study for tests.
Bookmark point.
And in the right frame of mind, you should do all day. Well, first off, when you hear you're going to have a test, you should figure out what kind of test it's going to be. Knowing if it's an essay test, multiple choice, true or false, or some combination of these will help you know what to expect. Right, then there's the actual studying. Give yourself plenty of time by scheduling study sessions in the days and even weeks. Cramming for a test the night before will stress you out. I also use the same spot for studying. It's a big desk in the basement with room to spread out, and no distractions like TVs or telephones to keep me from learning the material. Yeah, I keep meaning to organize my notes. If your notes look anything like mine, it may help to organize them, retyping them into an outline or some neater format that helps you study. Even the act of typing up your notes is a good way to study because you read it and be nervous. And sleep is really important. Being well rested will keep you calm and smart while you're taking the test. In fact, I like to go to bed early the night before an exam. Well, maybe not this early. Anyway, good luck with your test. Hey, turn the light back on. I have some studying to do.
Yeah, I How much love you? Shut the fuck up. This guy. The only person I can hear is you. I'm gonna book. I don't even hear his Daniel laugh. And that shit is so ugly.
And if you don't hear his Daniel laugh, how do you know if it's a Daniel laugh, huh?
What?
This is good. But this is doctor. What's up with you searching stuff that are dumb?
Go get a life.
Shut the fuck. Why are you naked?
Why are you saying
This is why Shorty. You got your problem. And how do you know you're the one that's annoying?
Your
You
office is so annoying. You know what I was so happy today because he was not loud. Every day I looked up to him. Well, usually it was to her teacher.
I don't even talk in the morning. I talk after my class starts.
Because you know you're going to get bitch smacked. You get beat up in the morning. And I woke up to that shit. And him, alright, when I wake up, all I see.
You know, the whole point of drumming is to keep some sort of beat.
Funny.
Let's take a break. Dear Tim and Moby, could you please do a movie on the volume of cylinders? I'm Victor. Well, Moby's drum is a cylinder. Stop.
Yeah, he's annoying.
Why do you care?
It's a three-dimensional object with
Yeah,
circles for bases.
and he starts,
We can find the volume of a cylinder
This
by
kid sucks too.
multiplying the area of its
But
base
you're the one
times
who
its
gets
height.
the You're in our head. Most of the time,
all
you don't,
yelling.
I don't care
Our
who the fuck
bases are
started.
circles,
If
and the
even if
formula
he
for
started, I
finding
would've
the
hit
area
you
of a
too.
circle is
I
pi
wouldn't even touch you, I
times the
would've hit you.
radius
You know
squared.
why? You're the one who lifted me up from my bed. The only person I heard was
Helps out with
him.
circles.
Why would I hit him? Because I didn't hear him.
Okay,
You know
so
what
the
I said?
diameter of the
You
drum's
did that, you
base
just told
is
like that.
24
You're like, is
centimeters.
that over here?
The radius is half the diameter. The radius is 12 centimeters. Let's round pi to 3.14. Then our base's area will be about 3.14
You
times
were
12
teaching me in the
squared.
kitchen, and then
That's about 452.16 square centimeters. Well, I say about because we rounded pi. But for what we're doing, this is fine. Now, the drum's height is 30 centimeters. We can plug that height and the base area into our formula. So, the volume of this cylinder is about 13,564.8 centimeters cubed. Now you know how to find the volume of a cylinder, the area of the base times the height. Of course, knowing the volume of the drum you're beating has nothing to do with having any sort of rhythm.
Where's Diane?
When he's in your room.
Disgusting. Diane, how do you spell gemography?
What?
Gemography.
Democracy?
No, the
He said
spelling.
democracy.
Gemography. Shut up, kid. Shut up, kid. Shut up.
Dear Tim and Moby, I need to write a paper on geography. What should I talk about? From Heveny. Studying the geography of a place will tell you about its landscape and where it's located, but also about the people who live there and the relationship between those people and their environment. Well, take the United States, for example. It's a big country, and the geography really varies, but we can talk about some major characteristics. So, where is it? Of course, we're talking about location. The U.S. is part of North America in the Western Hemisphere and in the Northern Hemisphere. Right, the equator divides the Northern and Southern Hemispheres. We can also talk about a particular region. In geography, a region is just an area that shares some characteristic with another area. Let's say you live in the New York tri-state region. Even though there are tons of different locations and people in that area, it still has a lot of things in common, like roadways, language, TV and radio stations, sports teams, weather, and so on. Region can be pretty specific or pretty vague, and an area can belong to more than one region. Like living in the New York tri-state region, you also live in the larger American East Coast region, as well as the temperate zone, which is larger still. By the way, region can also be cultural. For instance, you can talk about the Muslim world to talk about the region of the world where Islam is the main religion. Another thing to know about your geography is, what's it like here? Lots of factors figure into a sense of place. The language is mainly English, but it also has some Spanish and a mix of other languages from around the world. The people are a mix of immigrants from just about everywhere, and the architecture and buildings are quite varied in style and age. Well, the more specific you get about location and region, the more you can tell about place. Take, for example, New York City. It's located at about 40 degrees north latitude and about 74 degrees west longitude. New York City has a really large population, and it's really not all that big an area. So, city planners had to build upward. There are a lot of tall buildings for people to live and work in. New York City is often called a melting pot because it's so culturally diverse, but it can be broken down even more. Many neighborhoods are made up primarily of immigrants from many other countries, such as Italy, China, Poland, and many others. Well, people move around from place to place in search of a better life. That's another part of geography. Without movement, we wouldn't be here. And we're constantly in contact with our environment. The weather, sure. But also things like growing crops, burning fossil fuels, building dams, and digging wells. These are all ways that we interact with our environment. Well, they're not always positive ways. So, when you talk about the geography of a place, you want to explore the location. Where is it? The place. What is the area like? What's particular about the landscape, climate, and people who live there? region? What physical or cultural grouping does an area belong to?